Welcome to Functional Philosophy. I'm Charles Tew. That's T as in tango, E as in echo, and W as in whiskey. This is episode number 7, and its title is How to Understand Free Will and Learn the Two Most Powerful Thinking Methods There Are. Before I get started on the core of today's episode, I want to notify you of a few things about how this podcast is currently working. First, about the Q&A aspect of the podcast. Before I even launch, I'm recording 10 episodes. I'm going to launch with 5 and then release 1 per week afterward. Those 5 episodes will give me a month and a week of a buffer zone. So if I ever have to go away for a while or I can't do an episode, I'll have a month and a week's worth of content ready to go. Now, because of that, when I launch, I'll have already completed the first 10 episodes. So those won't have any Q&A. Now, depending on how fast I get questions, episode 11 may have a Q&A, but the questions would have to come in pretty fast for that. By the time you're hearing this, I will have already recorded episode 12, and I'll be working on 13. After I do these first 10 episodes, I'm not going to wait a month and a week before I start recording more. I'm going to continue to record 1 a week, so whenever you hear a podcast, it will have been recorded a month and a week earlier. There may be exceptions to that where I do something time sensitive, but aside from that, you'll be hearing stuff from a month and a week before. Now that has the benefit of ensuring a steady flow of content that I can take a month and a week break and you'll still get an unbroken flow of content, but the price for that is it'll be a month and a week behind. And so when I first start out, there's not going to be a Q&A section for at least a month and a week, and maybe a few episodes after that, depending on how fast questions come in. So I just wanted to clarify that aspect of the podcast. The other thing I wanted to notify you of is my setup. I'm not working in a studio. I'm working in my tiny apartment, and I have my microphone set up on top of a cardboard box on top of my ironing board in my tiny kitchen. Now, you have probably heard birds chirping and cars passing by and dogs barking. There's not a lot I can do about that. I think my windows are holograms because I can hear what's on the other side of them as if there were nothing in between us. So, I'm sorry for the ambient noise, but that's the best I can do right now. That's the best I can do for free. So, I hope you can put up with it. I hope the sound quality is good enough. I know sometimes it gets a little distorted. The volume is a little too dynamic. I try to do my best with all that, but this is the best I can do for now. As I get more contributors, make more money, audio quality will improve. So just bear with me for now. And if you want to try to help me make it better, please consider supporting me. So that's all for the notifications. I just want to keep you... I don't want this to seem like I'm some impersonal voice just talking to you from nowhere. I want you to know who I am, what I'm doing, how this is working. I'm a real person, so I'm trying to keep you up to date on how I, as a real person, am getting this podcast, how I'm running it. If you have feedback on sound quality or my release schedule or anything like that, feel free to send it to me. But for now, let's get into the core of today's episode. I've found that the way someone thinks about free will reveals whether he's ready to learn philosophy, or whether he really understands the philosophy he claims to hold. The approach most people take today toward free will makes them incapable of understanding all of the most important truths of philosophy. I can say from personal experience that many of you are going to end this episode as confused about the coherence of the concept of free will as you started it. There's nothing I can say to clarify this issue for you. All I can do is tell you where to look. This is one of those things that's so foundational, so obvious that it's easy to overlook. It's like scanning your PC for a rootkit. That kind of virus affects the operating system itself, and therefore subverts the very tools with which it might be detected. If what I say in this episode sounds incomprehensible, at bottom, you're just going to have to choose to understand me. I know that sounds strange, but the premises involved here are so fundamental that they can't be fixed by reference to deeper premises. You simply have to look in the right places to understand what I'm saying. Normally, if you have a premise, say, about economics, you can always go deeper to see if it integrates with, say, in this case, your knowledge of human nature. If it doesn't, you can revise your stance on economics, or, if necessary, change your view of human nature. You can even check your premises against your deepest philosophical premises, like the inviolable laws of logic, which you can know will never need to be revised. The idea we're talking about here, though, is self-evident, so you can't check it against anything deeper. So, I'm going to explain the common wrong view of free will, and then the right view, and in the process explain how the wrong view is putting blinders on you and getting you to ignore what you do see. So, let's begin. The mainstream view today is that free will is an illusion. We may feel as if we're freely choosing when we decide what to have for breakfast, but when we think about it logically, the very coherence of the idea of volition evaporates. Free will contradicts what must be true about the world. We know that everything has a cause. Every effect was caused by some antecedent action. Therefore, what you think or do cannot possibly be free. It's been determined since the first thing occurred in the universe. What specifically determines your thoughts and actions may be uncertain. It may be your genes, or your society, or God. Today, most say it's some combination of the first two. They debate nature versus nurture, but whether atoms or influence, they agree that you didn't cause you. You were caused by something outside of and prior to you. You didn't build you, as Obama might say. Mechanistic, billiard ball style, linear causality rules everything in existence, they say. There is no coherent alternative. Even if there were, the opposite of determinism is indeterminism, and random choices would be no freer than mechanistic ones. If your choices are predetermined, they aren't free. But if they're random, you didn't choose them in that case either. One way people try to save free will is with a view called compatibilism. Compatibilism is the carving out of a range of deterministic forces that will be arbitrarily exempt from being considered to violate free will. Different compatibilists offer different exemptions, but they have ideas like, if someone grabs your hand and forces you to type out a death threat and send it to someone, that's not free will. If it's just your genes responsible for the typing, though, then that is free will. They don't believe that anything could have been otherwise. They simply believe that it's important to distinguish some kinds of mechanistic influences from others. This is a cowardly, dishonest, counterproductive approach to the issue. There is no reason to hold on to the concept of free will if one holds this viewpoint. Free will refers to an ability to choose between alternatives, any of which are actually possible. Compatibilists like Daniel Dennett would do well to start identifying themselves as determinists, because they're not actually claiming any compatibility between the alternatives of free will and determinism. They're simply pointing out what they imagine are useful distinctions between types of deterministic forces. You'll find very little substantive argument over the issue of free will outside of the ideas I've laid out. Defenders of actual free will are basically impotent and usually mystical. Now, many people have the thoughts about free will I've described, but shoo them away because they don't want to start thinking that they don't choose what they do. They rightly fear the consequences of that belief. If you confront them with the issue explicitly, however, they'll surrender and admit that they must not have free will. Determinism is one of those ideas that people don't hold explicitly and try to avoid, but whose truth they will admit immediately upon being challenged. Many of you listening are expecting me now to go into how determinism is all wrong, but you can't imagine what I might say. I've already disparaged compatibilism and mysticism, so what kind of argument could I possibly have? It may seem to you as if I'm about to try to convince you that 2 plus 2 equals 5, or that a square is a circle. If that is your attitude, then I'm glad you're listening, because you are in most desperate need of what I'm about to explain. Free will is actually a superficial issue here. It's important, and I will explain it, but you're going to get something much more valuable in the process, if you choose to grasp it. If you can't imagine what I'm going to say about free will, then there are 2 ways you're misusing your mind that are together keeping you from recognizing reality. They're giving you a tremendous blind spot and distorting all of your cognition. And they're both operative in your misunderstanding of free will, which is why you have so much trouble with this particular issue, and why it's the perfect choice of subject for correcting these 2 misuses of your mind. I also want to address objectivists specifically here. The issue of free will is a dividing line also between those who truly understand objectivism and those who don't. In my experience with objectivists, it is the hardest thing for them to wrap their minds around, because they come from the same culture everyone else does, so it's no surprise that they're trapped by the same confusion. I think most objectivists accept free will as a working hypothesis because the rest of Ayn Rand's philosophy is so valuable, and it's all interconnected, so they take it to get the other benefit, but never prove it to themselves. If someone can get past this hurdle, then he's past the single biggest hurdle in the race to philosophical understanding. In a certain way, I really don't think there's anything as difficult as the issue of free will in all of philosophy. There are more complex issues, but nothing as deceptively simple. If you get past the issue of free will, you can consider yourself free from the culture. You'll be like Neo waking up in that pot of pink gelatin after being unplugged from the Matrix. You'll be in the real world and ready to start understanding it. So, let's get you out of that pod. What are the 2 ways in which you're misusing your mind? First, you're not being introspective. Second, you are being rationalistic. You're not looking at your mind, and you're not looking at reality. Or, rather, you're looking at reality when you should be looking at your mind, and you're looking at your mind when you should be looking at reality. Let's deal with introspection first. It's shocking how little people introspect. Not how little people introspect. How seldom people introspect. How seldom they think about their own thinking. Introspection is the act of looking inward at the processes of your own consciousness. This is an incredible blind spot for most people, and having this blind spot is disastrous. I could do many episodes on all of the ideas that depend on introspection for their validation, and free will is one of them. The validation of free will is entirely introspective. You simply have to observe what you are doing in fact when you make a choice. Are you being pulled along irresistibly, or are you choosing irreducibly? If you look inward, you'll see that you are the author of your choices. No one and nothing makes you choose whether you activate your mind and focus. That's up to you, and you don't need any more evidence than that. Your mind is a valid subject of observation. Most people don't think that way. They think they have to come up with some argument or mathematical proof for free will. But they don't. You don't have to prove that you see a table in front of you. You don't have to give an argument that it's there. There's a lot more you can learn about the table than what you learn at just a glance, but a glance is sufficient to know it exists. Free will is exactly the same way. There's more to say about what kinds and configurations of matter produce volitional consciousness, but the fact that it exists is available to every healthy human being. Just like you will never learn anything that disproves the existence of the table, even if you learn it's made out of this or that material, so you'll never learn anything that disproves the existence of free will, even if you learn this or that about what makes it possible and what its limits are. I want to stress here that the argument that determinism is self-refuting because you'd never be able to know if it were true, is not the proof of free will. Your direct, first-hand observation of your own freedom of choice is the proof, not any rationalistic argument. Okay, so let's say you buy that you observe introspectively your freedom of choice. How then do you reconcile that with a solid causal reality? That gets us to rationalism. Rationalism is the use of concepts and logic without basing either in reality. Rationalism is the practice of enshrining at the base of all thought intuitions about reality and deducing consequences from them. You don't accept reality on its own terms if you're a rationalist. You think about how reality must be. You pluck premises out of the ether, and then you proceed to infer what must logically be true or false about reality, based on your arbitrary premises. One such arbitrary premise is that all physical entities must be affected only by other physical entities, or that if they are affected by consciousness somehow, then consciousness must be mechanistic. Now, I have no argument against these propositions. All I have is my finger, which is pointing at reality while I'm saying, look. Reality simply is a certain way. It's too bad if you don't like it, or if you wouldn't have done it that way, but that's how it is. There is nothing in reality that excludes the influence of consciousness on the material world, and nothing that says that the actions of consciousness must be the linear result of prior causes. This actually goes back to a lack of introspection. Why do these faulty premises seem so plausible to people? It's because they don't introspect. The reality of consciousness and its ability to go one way or the other is alien to them because they never spend time looking at it. There's a reason things go this way so often. Before one can introspect, one must extrospect. Consciousness is the faculty of awareness. Before one can observe one's being aware of something, one must be aware of something. So if you're going to stop before you look everywhere, you're going to stop outside before you go inside. You can't get inside before you go outside. If you never look inside, then everything you see is physical and linear. So there you go. Everything is like that. Done deal, wrap up for the day. Except you missed a crucial aspect of reality, which is consciousness. And the thing you have to understand is, reality dictates. I know Spock said logic dictates, but logic is only valid because it's derived from reality. So if you see yourself making choices, then no assumption of billiard ball style causality should override that. So, introspect and start with reality. Don't ignore your mind, and don't use its subjective products as a justification for ignoring reality. If you do those two things, you'll be able to understand free will and how it can exist, and you'll have a proper foundation for understanding everything else. If you don't do them, then no matter how much you understand, you'll have a phantom understanding, always empty, tenuous, foggy, unclear. Do those two things, and start building your worldview on an unshakable foundation. That's it for what I wanted to get across in this episode, but I don't want to leave you hanging with the other questions about free will that you probably have, so I'm going to go on for a little while as a little bit of a bonus. Let's dig into the causality of free will. Entities are primary, not actions. The identity of an entity determines how it will act, not a mere chain of action and reaction, disconnected from the things performing the actions. If you hit a billiard ball into another billiard ball, the second ball will react a certain way, based on its nature. If you hit an egg with a billiard ball, it will crack open and make a mess. It won't roll around like a billiard ball. The action a thing takes depends on its nature, its identity. And the identity of the human brain is such that it, with the help of other components of the human body, produces consciousness. Consciousness which itself has an identity. Free will is causal because it's caused by the specific, delimited identity of human consciousness, which is in turn caused by the specific identity of man's physical components. The most common objection to what I'm saying is that it's no different from saying that the identity of human consciousness is that it lacks identity, that its definite nature is that it's indefinite. That's wrong. Free will is definite and acts in a definite context, but definite does not mean linear, and identity is not linearity. Actually, another criticism determinists make illustrates my point here, so I'm going to jump to it for a second and then come right back. Sam Harris, the famous atheist, neuroscientist, and determinist, often uses the following example. If I ask you to pick a city, then whatever city you pick comes to your mind unbidden. You didn't choose to think of that city. It just came to you. This is true of every thought you have. You can see introspectively that you're not choosing what comes into your mind. You're not choosing your thoughts. When you speak, words just come out. It's a mystery to you as they come out. You didn't write them down and read them off a page. They're just coming. If the choice of picking a city in this context isn't free, Sam says, then no choice is, because there are no constraints here. But if you examine the choice, you'll see that your alleged free will is nowhere to be found. Now, back to the question of identity. Identity means having a definite nature. It doesn't mean reacting linearly to every influence. Free will is not indefinite in any way. When you face a choice among a finite number of definite, specific alternatives that were encountered after a process of definite interaction with definite entities. The city example illustrates this. The world around you and your subconscious presented you with a definite, unavoidable choice given your circumstances in that example. Your choice was to focus on what Sam was saying, or to ignore it by dropping focus and drifting passively. That's free will, a definite choice in a definite context based on identity all the way through. Now I'm going to deal with the alleged deterministic nature of thought in Sam's example. Sam ignores in his example that the locus of free will is in the conscious mind, not the subconscious. He believes that your subconscious feeds you thoughts and that therefore you don't have free will. Free will, in his view, would then be a choice made in the context of a simultaneous conscious grasp of all contents of the mind. That's the only way you could know what you were going to think before you thought it. But that's incoherent, so free will collapses. Your thoughts will always have to come from somewhere before they get into your mind, in his view. The alternative is self-contradiction, mysticism. That's his view. Now mine. Free will is about how you deal with what your senses and subconscious present to you. A city coming into your mind when someone asks you to pick a city is an automatic process of the subconscious. But how you choose to deal with your subconscious isn't automatic. You don't choose what you think specifically, but you choose what to think about broadly, and more fundamentally, whether to focus. Free will is your ability to focus, to choose to be aware of reality. Whether it's the external world or the operations of your mind as it deals with the external world. Free will is saying, I'm going to be in focus enough to even be paying attention to the question Sam asks. You could have chosen to drift in a daze and not pay attention. A city wouldn't have come to your mind in that case. After you choose to focus or not, you face definite facts and thoughts that you can't avoid and don't directly choose. But the choice to focus itself is free. Once you chose to pay attention in Sam's example, then the city you thought of was inevitable. But you didn't have to pay attention. That's free will. Free will is like managing a team under you. If you've ever seen Mad Men, it's like when Don orders his artists to create a mock-up for an ad. His artists create something and present it to him, and Don then accepts, discards, or files away the sketches they brought him. That's what happens when you choose to be in focus. You order what you need from your subconscious and deal with what it gives you. You choose to pay attention to your surroundings, and when they strike you, you choose how to file them away. And then later you choose what you want your subconscious to send you up, and it sends you up information depending on how you chose to file it. You're walking along in a park. You choose to be in focus, and not in a daze. You notice that the leaves are blowing in the wind in a particularly fluid way. That's free will. Choosing to pay attention. Choosing to focus. Identifying your surroundings, and therefore filing them in a certain way. Now later, you're writing a short story, and you notice the need for imagery manifesting fluidity. You ask your subconscious for imagery of this kind. It sends up the leaves blowing in the wind. That's free will. You didn't choose to think of the leaves, but you chose to be in focus while writing a story, and therefore to be aware of what kind of imagery your story needed, and therefore to send the order for fluidity down. On top of that, the noticing of the leaves in the first place was dependent on your free choice, and the filing away of them under fluid was also dependent on your free choice. You did all of those things because you chose to focus. And if you hadn't chosen to focus, you wouldn't have done them. Your subconscious is just a computer. Free will doesn't reside there. The analogy of the whole mind as a computer breaks down at a certain point, because the mind itself has a user, which is your conscious mind. When you use a physical computer, it's not just a computer using another computer. It's you, your conscious mind, using your mental computer to use a physical computer. A computer doesn't think. It gives output based on input. It requires a user to make sense of anything going on with it. Your subconscious is exactly the same way. It means nothing without your conscious awareness. Misunderstanding this is, incidentally, why people fear conscious, artificially intelligent machines taking over the world and destroying human beings. They conceive of consciousness as nothing but a certain level of information processing. In a sense, that's true, because a computer doesn't deal with information. Only conscious beings do. These people are reversing the order of information and consciousness. There's no information in the universe. There are conscious beings who can use bits of the universe as symbols and then set up systems that result in certain symbols being displayed when certain things happen. When you use a calculator, the computer isn't figuring out that 2 + 2 = 4. It's displaying a symbol that means something only to people who are familiar with it and who know that the system has been set up to give that symbol only under certain conditions. If you didn't know that, it would be meaningless, like a language no one knows how to read, or random marks in the dirt made by leaves blown around by the wind. So you're never going to get consciousness, or therefore volition, just by putting together a big enough information processing device. Everything in the universe is an information processing device if human beings choose to take it that way. If I choose to take a certain kind of humming as a symbol of a certain range of low temperatures, then my refrigerator is an information processing device, because it hums when it's cold. I can take the rustling of leaves as symbolic of the wind. Every case of the rustling of leaves doesn't have to be representative of wind in order for some specific rustling on some specific tree to indicate it to me. Just like how alphabet serial can form a sentence by chance without invalidating language or your ability to know that a book was written purposely. So everything can be an information processing system. But obviously everything doesn't give rise to consciousness, unless you're a primitive, mystical panpsychist. This is actually a great example of how positions in philosophy can worm all around and take you to all kinds of places you didn't sign up for. This conception of information is easily appropriated as a defense of panpsychism, the idea that consciousness resides everywhere in the universe. What gives rise to consciousness can't depend on what's given symbolic meaning by an observer. That is, however, exactly what most people, including very famous scientists and Ivy League PhDs, think, even if they don't see the anti-scientific implications of their misconceptualization of information. Their view is that information processing, with information conceived of as some intrinsic thing in the universe, something known with no knower, produces consciousness when it reaches a certain level of complexity. They say that the alternative is to think that certain kinds of matter are magic. It's not magic. It's just irreducible identity. Different kinds and configurations of matter have different properties. You can't get underneath that or explain it. It's just reality. Irreducibility isn't magic. You may as well say that the universe, existence itself, is magic, because it's self-sufficient and can't be questioned. Sam Harris actually says that the only thing more mysterious than the existence of consciousness is the existence of existence. That, however, is an invalid approach. There is no "why does the universe exist?" Heidegger asked that nonsensical question too, even though Aristotle had recognized 2,500 years earlier that the question is incoherent. Existence and the properties of every part of it are self-sufficient primaries. But many people's view is that the idea of existence having identity on its own is magic, unscientific. The idea of consciousness imbuing existence with identity, by perceiving it as information, that's scientific. That's not magic. Can you see the inversion here? The privileging of awareness over existence, over what awareness is aware of. This is another case of the primacy of consciousness versus the primacy of existence. How you perceive the world is taken as the starting point, but the world is the starting point. Certain kinds of matter in certain configurations produce volitional consciousness. Information processing does not. If you have any questions about anything in today's episode or anything at all within reason, you can just send me an email at charles.a.2@gmail.com. That's TEW for 2. You can also check out my website at charlestew.com. There you can find information on and links to everything I do. You can also find ways to support this podcast and all of my work there. The biggest way you can support it is by donating through Patreon, and I have all kinds of rewards there, including tutoring if you contribute at a certain level. You can also leave a review for this podcast on iTunes or wherever you happen to listen to it. Those reviews are really a big help, and I appreciate your doing anything to help me out. So, thank you for that. Thanks for listening, and let's meet again in episode 8.